there are two traps that we can fall into. One is not being discouraged when we recognize that we still have areas to grow. And the other is not to become spiritually arrogant as we progress. I know not any of us, but I just thought this would be an idea you could take out and share with your friends, okay? Those people. And this is where the story of Pema Chodrin comes in. Now, Pema Chodrin, as I said earlier, she's this world-renowned Buddhist nun who has written many, many works. I adore her works. I've been inspired by many of her works. You may have seen her book, When Things Fall Apart, Start Where You Are, Comfortable with Uncertainty. Those are just to name a few. I know we've carried her books in our bookshop. We have CDs in there right now. And the key thing, and Gail Palat sitting in the front row will be happy to point you to those CDs in the bookshop. But the key theme in her work that you will find in everything is to cultivate this mindfulness, something I talked about last week, of being able to get still and just notice our thoughts, notice our patterns, and to absolutely be willing to admit to those ways that we're not living up to our expectations, to admit to those patterns of thought that we feel don't reflect the best that we have to offer, and to also be compassionate, to not let those behaviors and thoughts define us. That if we can look upon these thought patterns as something that is just, that we can be curious about, like, oh, how fascinating that I'm so attached to that outcome. How interesting that I'm still so angry about this situation. If we can look at it in that way and call forth compassion to just say, okay, this is a human process. I'm evolving. This is coming up for me. We're much more likely to be able to admit to our errors or to the ways that we're not living up to our potential, and to gradually call forth that compassion and greater goodness in us and move forward. And as we become more compassionate with ourselves, less judgmental of those ways that we're not living up to our highest and greatest potential, we're more likely to be less judgmental and compassionate with others, because we have now cultivated this muscle of compassion in us. And this is very much in keeping with our science of mind tenets, that we promote this idea of being mindful of our thoughts, because our thoughts are creative. And so to notice when our thoughts are not in alignment with love, in alignment with a sense of goodness and joy, and when we're getting engaged in fear-based limiting thoughts, to own up to them, to just admit, this is what I'm thinking, but not to let that make us feel less than, but just to know there's a greater good in us. There's that potential of God that can move us through it. So the story I heard about Pema was my dear friend Reverend Bonnie up in Ventura, who was telling me about having read a story about Pema having been at a Buddhist retreat. And at this retreat, all were treated equally. So whether you were a well-known, as she was, author, or some Buddhist figure that was known in the world, or someone who had just come to the retreat that no one had ever met before, everyone was seen as equal. Everyone was to pitch in and engage in menial tasks. And I understand that she had some kind of physical challenge. Maybe I think it was something going on with her back. But it prevented her from performing the tasks to the best of her ability. And being a Buddhist tradition, to just observe and note things, people would point out to her when she had not done something as well as she could have. And she said that she noticed her thoughts kind of went to this, don't they know who I am? Noticed how no matter how tactfully someone pointed out whatever she hadn't done well, that she didn't like it, that she did not enjoy that process at all, and she much preferred going into town, those times that she could get away from the retreat center, where people recognized her as Pema Chodrin and just were so delighted and honored to meet her. And she noticed how much she liked that. And she shared that with one of the masters at the retreat, and he told her, well, how wonderful. That just must have been terrific for you to be able to notice those thought patterns and to realize that you were engaged in these ego-based types of thoughts. And she looked at him and said, not really.